Do you often feel stressed internally, even when you're at home and have no reason to? Or do you sometimes feel like other people are exhausting and the whole world is a threat, basically? These are just two examples of how trauma consequences can play out, but there's many different ways. As promised, today I wanted to make a whole video on trauma healing and why it's one of the most important things we need to talk about. This video is trigger-free and not about anything horrible at all, but more on that in a minute. First, I just wanted to make a little disclaimer that I'm not a therapist or expert on this. I'm just sharing what I've learned over the last year or so in extensive self-study and exploration. And as always, I want to add that this, of course, comes from my individual experience and it will be different for everybody. So, what is trauma? How do we know if we're affected and what to do? We don't really like to hear this word, or worse, have anything to do with it. That's why many people never really look into this topic. The misconception here is that trauma is only things like accidents and other horrific events. This is what is called shock trauma. But there's also something called developmental trauma. And this is what I want to focus on today, this lesser known type. Because it does affect most of us. It could have saved me years of searching if I had known about this sooner. And not just me, I know and have known many people who would have benefited greatly from this knowledge. Developmental or attachment trauma happens from when we are in the womb to about 6 years old. Our birth mother and then whoever is our main caretaker plays the most important role here. When our human core needs aren't met during this time, we can't develop properly. A lack of self-regulation, sense of self, and self-esteem are the result. Our ability to regulate emotions gets disrupted, as well as our autonomic nervous system, so things like breathing, heart rate, digestion, sleep, and so on. All of this is, by the way, from a book called Healing Developmental Trauma, and I would highly recommend it. I'll link it in the description below. So when our core needs aren't met during this time, we feel like something is wrong with them and ultimately with us. And so we start to create these coping mechanisms and strategies. And I'll give you a few examples of how this can look like in children. They start to disconnect from the outside and become invisible. Or they start to give up their own needs and focus on the needs of their parents or siblings. Some also give up their authenticity and expressions of independence in order to feel loved and accepted. And then others try to perfect themselves for their parents. There are many different ways this can play out. These strategies help us to grow up, but later in life become a huge burden. They hinder us from connection to ourselves and others and thriving in the world and beyond. So how do we know whether we're affected and in which way? Well, basically wherever there is a dimming down of life force, of aliveness, or problems with connection to ourselves and other people. In the book it says that it seems like we humans suffer from so many different emotional problems, but really most of them can be traced back to early trauma. We live in a world where most generations before us experienced trauma. It's in our DNA and our parents got it as well. So even though you might have had a fairly nice childhood, it's enough if your mother had a dysregulated nervous system herself for you as a baby to experience it as well. And then as adults, in relationships for example, most of us fall into one of these two categories. We either become super clingy and go towards codependency, or we'd rather do everything by ourselves and go towards autonomy. The latter would be true for me. And I also had this constant inner stress, for example, high pulse, inner heat, I got nervous really easily. And life just felt a bit restricted, like no matter what I did to try and change things, it never really would be let out of this bubble. It all was kind of a fight. Maybe this was also the reason why I stopped singing and started my spiritual search at such a young age. There's one very interesting paragraph in the book about esoteric approaches that I wanted to read. Many people recognize the power of now, as Eckhart Tolle calls it, but because of their nervous system dysregulation, they are unable to remain in the present moment. Falling short of this ideal becomes another reason for individuals with trauma to feel bad about themselves. So this really hit home, and I feel like many people can relate to this. Another huge aspect of trauma is that we disconnect from our bodies. So some start to live only in their heads and become very intellectual. Others go even beyond that into the spiritual and energetic realm. Some are just everywhere and don't have real boundaries and are constantly with others, for example. Then some focus on their physical strength alone and on their appearance. Or they are completely lost in their emotions. But we are all not really living in our bodies as such. Which brings me to my next point, which is how to heal trauma, what to do. The two main factors are the body and connection. Most traditional therapy approaches don't work because it's only talking, sitting across from each other, talking about things about the past or solutions. But we couldn't even talk yet when most of this originated, so obviously this falls short. This stuff is stored in our body and shows in our relationships. Most of it is unconscious and not accessible with our mind. However, understanding things intellectually is also one important part, of course. One of the best approaches I've come across is called narm, N-A-R-M. It combines working with the body and human connection and also adds mindful awareness to it. You can find therapists who work with this approach, but any body-oriented therapy is great, like somatic experiencing, SE, or neuroaffective touch, for example. I'll try and link as many resources as possible down below. Myself, I did a bunch of different things. First, lots of self-study, like reading books and watching videos online, just getting into the topic and understanding it on an intellectual level. Then I found a really great trauma therapist who also has a spiritual background, who developed his own approach. So I went to a live workshop, which was really great, eye-opening and very helpful. Next, I started a narm therapy, which also worked over Zoom, by the way. I also did an extensive online course all about self-regulation, coming in contact with your body again, having boundaries, etc. Therapy with a real human being is always the best, of course, and there's also many things you can do by and for yourself. There's great things online. For example, I also attended a huge group Zoom retreat for a weekend, all about collective trauma in women. And I also went to a local group regular local group in my town. And over time, just met new people, created genuine connections and healing. I'll link the things I've mentioned below, and some of it is only in German, but maybe I can find different things. I'd say that I've never understood myself and life as much as I do now. Trauma therapy was one of the most eye-opening things I've ever done. Finally, everything just started to make sense. And you know I've tried a lot on my spiritual path, like shadow work, healing the inner child, learning about the subconscious, but nothing has ever been as profound as this. The thing with developmental trauma is that you don't realize you have it. It's all you've ever known since you were little. It's normal for you. So it's quite hard to get out of it by yourself. That's why it's so important that you have the right kind of information and also a little outside help, at least in the beginning, and then you can go on by yourself. It will all depend on your situation, of course, and what kind of trauma and how severe, and whether the problem's more with your body or with other people. If, for example, you are already quite introverted and isolated and don't have many people to talk to, starting with a therapist would be really beneficial. Although, or especially because, that's not what you'd usually do. And that's the thing, it's so important that we embed new and different experiences into our nervous system. And in the end, it's all about real connection. The thing with trauma is that it creates separation between you and yourself and other people and the world. The way to heal this is by communicating our inner states with one another. I also promised you a video on this. This is when energy starts to flow again between us, and where there is openness and honesty, love really. And that's the key also with ourselves. Genuine compassion. Not the taking a bath kind of self-love, but understanding ourselves so deeply, knowing why we've turned out the way we are, which automatically creates such a profound level of understanding and compassion for yourself. I think this is when I really understood what self-love actually meant. And this is the key in this whole healing process. Oh, and one last thing I'd like to mention is the relationship with your parents as an adult. It's probably obvious now why it can be so triggering to be around them. Because it always activates these traumatized parts in us, even if today things are different. That's why it's not only allowed, but even advised to keep a bit more distance to them, at least in the beginning. I know this seems to be a huge taboo, like family is everything. But seeing a different side to this and learning that it's actually healthy to detach can be quite liberating. Of course, this will be different for everybody, but just something to think about. And by the way, having a guru does not replace genuine relationships and connection. The funny thing is that by healing trauma and allowing contact, it automatically opens up the spiritual realm, or at least makes it much more easy to access. So that's it for today. I hope I could give you a little intro into this big topic. Maybe you have already known most of this, but for some it could have been important information. I'm always so happy to read from you in the comments, and I quit Instagram a while ago, but I've recently started a Telegram channel, so if you want to know when I upload a new video and some behind the scenes and so on, then I would be happy to welcome you over there. The link is in the description. So have a nice day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!